I used to think people made up stories like this, nurses whispering ghost tales behind the desk when the ward got too quiet. I'd laugh along, of course, but deep down, I believed hospitals were just buildings. Fluorescent lights, antiseptic smell, the endless hum of machines. I never thought they could hold on to things the way people do. I never thought they could remember. This happened during the second year of my rotation at a rehabilitation hospital, a low-slung gray building off an old logging road in rural Oregon. The kind of place surrounded by pines and fog, where the sky always looked like it hadn't made up its mind about rain. I worked the evening shift, mostly, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. on the second floor, the long-term stroke recovery wing. We had 12 patients on our ward, most of them older, recovering slowly, their days blending together in TV noise and the shuffle of nurses' shoes. There was a woman we had there, Marla, mid-60s. Her speech had been affected by a massive stroke, but she was sharp underneath it all. Clear blue eyes, white curls flattened to one side of her head. She always had this look like she was watching something you couldn't see. The other staff joked she was a psychic. She went along with it, would offer readings to the night nurse, or tell the new techs who'd call out sick that week. Nothing serious. We all saw it as part of her charm. She once told me I'd hear from someone I hadn't thought about in years. The next morning, I got a letter from a cousin I hadn't spoken to since high school. Coincidence, I told myself. Pure chance, but it stayed with me. One evening, the ward was calm. The kind of calm that made the clock tick louder than usual. A storm had passed through earlier and left behind a damp chill in the building. The windows fogged on the inside. Most patients were asleep. The halls smelled like stale coffee and plastic. I was finishing some charting at the nurse's station. Marla had been quieter than usual that day. Didn't ask for her extra blanket. Didn't make a joke when I handed her medication. Around 9:40, her call light blinked. When I stepped into her room, she was sitting up, eyes wide, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "He's gone," she said. Her voice had that slow, deliberate tone stroke patients often have, but the words came out clearer than usual. "Who's gone?" I asked, stepping in, checking her monitor. "Nothing unusual. The man in 21. He just passed. You should go check." Room 2112 was at the far end of the corridor. The person staying there is a man in his mid-70s with heart issues, recovering from a fall that fractured his hip. He'd been alert earlier. We'd talked about baseball. I remember he'd laughed when I told him I couldn't name a single player. I hesitated. No alarms had gone off, no beeps, no change in vitals reported on the board. Still, something about the way she said it, calm, almost like she was stating a fact everyone already knew, made me go. I walked slowly, my shoes making soft squeaks on the linoleum. The corridor lights flickered slightly, something they did when the generator kicked in, though there hadn't been an outage. The door to 212 was closed. I knocked lightly, then opened it. He was lying on his back, hands folded neatly on his chest, eyes shut, peaceful. Still, I stepped closer and felt it immediately, that strange stillness, the kind that fills a room right after someone dies. You don't need monitors or machines to tell you, you just know. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. His hand was warm, but not alive. I called for help, followed protocol. Another nurse came in, confirmed. Time of death, 9:43 p.m. Later, I went back to Marla's room. She was still sitting upright, staring toward her open doorway. She turned to me like she'd been waiting. "He didn't know where to go," she said. "He was wandering, confused. I had to help him find the door." I didn't say anything. I just stood there. "They don't always realize it right away," she went on. "Some of them stay for a while. Some need help." "You saw him?" I asked. "He walked past my room," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "But he wasn't wearing his gown, just light, just sadness." I didn't ask any more questions. When our shift ended at 11, I waited in my car for a while before driving. Rain began to mist on the windshield. The wipers made a soft, slow beat. In the rearview mirror, The building's second-floor windows glowed in rows, except for one, where the light flickered, then went dark. I used to think I'd seen every kind of strange thing in hospitals, especially after 10 years of working nights. There's something about the late hours that makes everything feel a little off. Maybe it's the tired eyes. Maybe it's the long shadows and fluorescent light. Or maybe it's that we're all just trying to keep it together, quietly battling chaos with coffee and clipboards. This happened at a private facility in western Pennsylvania. It wasn't a massive hospital, just a mid-size regional place with an old elevator that groaned every time it opened, and floors that always smelled faintly of bleach and something sour underneath. I was floating that month between departments, which meant I ended up working a lot of shifts on the geriatric ward. 3rd floor, East Wing. There was a patient there, an older woman, probably in her late 80s. I never actually got her full file. The only thing I know for sure is that she was tough, stocky, loud, and relentless. She'd come in weeks earlier, after a stroke that had left her confused and mostly bedridden. Her chart labeled her as moderately combative, which was putting it lightly. Her room just across from the nurse's station was positioned there intentionally. That wasn't a coincidence. They'd moved her there to keep an eye on her. She needed constant supervision. The aides had taken to assigning a sitter in her room during the night, just to make sure she didn't yank out her IV lines or try to stand up and fall again. I remember the first night I had her on my rounds. You could hear her shouting 2 doors down. Not words, just guttural, almost rhythmic yelling. She wasn't calling for help. It was more like she was fighting someone no one else could see. She'd thrash under the blankets like she was wrestling her sheets, kick the side rail with the heel of her foot until the whole bed rattled. One of the newer aides said she woke up once and found her staring straight at her, completely silent, just grinning. Sleep-wake disturbance, the attending had said. Likely delirium. That's the kind of diagnosis that gives everyone just enough distance to keep working. You nod, you adjust the meds, and you carry on. But on this particular night, early February, heavy snow outside, we were all dragging. The ward was dim and quiet, except for the usual monitor beeps and the occasional overhead call. That patient had been quieter than usual that day, almost still. Around 2:40 in the morning, I was at the station reviewing charts when one of the vitals monitors started beeping. Her heart rate was trending down fast, from 60 to 40, then a slow, drawn-out descent, 30, 22, then nothing but a flat line. I got up and walked into the room with one of the other nurses. The aide was already there. The woman was lying flat on her back, eyes open, mouth slightly parted. Still, the monitor beside her confirmed what I already knew. No pulse, no breath sounds, pupils fixed. I checked the wrist for any hint of warmth, any rhythm under the skin. Nothing. She was a DNR. It had been confirmed 3 times. No code, no crash cart, no panic, just protocol. So, we did what we always do. We shut off the monitor. I gently closed her eyes. The aide pulled the privacy curtain halfway as I stepped out to notify the supervisor and prepare the paperwork for the death report. Another nurse went to contact the family. The sitter stayed behind to begin cleaning the body. We gave her gloves, supplies, the usual bag with the gown and sheet set for post-mortem care. I remember hearing her quietly humming to herself as we walked away, like she was trying to make the task more bearable. I was in the hallway, halfway through documenting the time of death, when the call bell from that room lit up again. I paused, just looked at it. One of the other nurses chuckled and said something like, "Old habits die hard." I didn't laugh. Then the sitter's voice crackled over the intercom. She sounded confused, breathless. Can someone come in here, please? She's awake." I froze mid-step. "What do you mean awake?" I asked, already walking back toward the room. "I mean, she's moving. She's fighting. She's trying to get up." I stepped back into the room, and I swear to you, for a second my body didn't feel like it belonged to me. There she was, sitting up in bed, pale as ever, eyes wide open, swatting at the sitter's hands like a fly had just buzzed past her face. Her voice came out dry and rasping. like someone dragging a rake across gravel. "Where is it?" she mumbled. It was here. She grabbed the bed rail and started rocking, like she was trying to get the momentum to swing her legs over. Her skin was still cold, her face blank, but her body was active, twitching, moving with that same wild energy she always had, like nothing had happened. No pulse, no breath, for nearly 10 minutes. And now, this. None of us had a real explanation. The supervisor shrugged it off as some kind of electrical misread. One of the aides said maybe the pulse had just been too weak to detect. Another said she might have been in some kind of catatonic state, and we just misunderstood. But I've seen death. Real death. I've zipped the bag, I've called the families. This woman had been gone. And now she was swinging at people like she'd never missed a heartbeat. She didn't talk much after that, at least not to me. Mostly murmuring to herself, reaching toward the corners of the room, with fingers curled like claws. I caught her more than once staring at the ceiling for hours, eyes fixed on nothing I could see. They moved her to a long-term care facility later that week, and I think about her more than I'd like to admit. Because if death can be reversed just like that, like a button being unpressed, then what exactly is keeping the rest of us from slipping over and stumbling right back? It's strange how silence in a hospital never truly means peace. You'd think that in a place where pain and panic hang in the air like the constant hum of fluorescent lights, silence would be welcome. But sometimes the quieter the ward gets, the heavier it feels. I've worked in several departments over the years, cardiology, trauma, geriatrics, but nothing has ever stayed with me quite like the time I rotated through the burn unit in Phoenix. The building was old, or at least it looked that way. Yellowed walls that no scrubbing could brighten. Ventilation that clicked and sighed like it had lungs of its own. I still remember how the corridors smelled. Part antiseptic, part charred meat. That smell settles deep behind your nose, in a place your senses can't easily wash out. It was my 3rd week in rotation. I'd gotten used to the rhythm. Hourly vitals, dressing changes, patients groaning through morphine fog. That day the ward was unusually tense. A new patient had been brought in during the night. A man in his mid-40s with 3rd-degree burns along his arms, shoulders, and chest. The story, as whispered between nurses on break, was ugly. The man had been set on fire by a woman he had kept under his thumb. Someone he'd been controlling for years, allegedly. From what I gathered, she'd finally snapped. She didn't just douse him, she clung to him. That's what someone said. Wrapped herself around him like she was trying to drag him into the same fire. She ended up admitted as well. Severe burns over her back, face, and throat. Inhalation injuries. Her voice was gone by the time she got to us. She was placed on the far end of the ward, 2 doors down from the nurse's break room. The man? He was put all the way at the other end, closest to the double doors that led out to the stairwell. No family listed. No visitors came for either of them. The only noise came from the machines, the IV alarms, and the occasional gurgle of someone trying to cough past melted lungs. We didn't talk about the case openly. You learn to stay quiet in hospitals. There's too much tragedy to speak about every time. But even among the nurses who'd seen far worse, there was a stiffness in the air whenever either of their charts came up. Both of them stayed alive longer than expected. Her burns were worse, but she fought harder. She couldn't speak, couldn't eat, but her eyes were sharp, aware. I only worked directly with her twice. She never looked at me, not once. Kept her eyes angled toward the ceiling or the corner. I remember wondering if she was afraid to look anyone in the face, or maybe ashamed, or maybe it was something else entirely. One night, I was on the 2nd shift, just before midnight. The hallway outside their rooms was dim, most lights shut down for the overnight crew. The unit was quiet, apart from the distant sound of someone moaning in room 6 and the low hiss of oxygen from the main wall line. I was reviewing notes at the station when the overhead code chime rang, a soft alert, not a full emergency. I saw a CNA walk quickly past me with a crash cart, heading toward her room. I followed, not thinking, just doing what I'd been trained to do. She had coded full respiratory failure. There was no saving her, not really. Too much tissue damage. Her lungs were already fragile, probably more scar than lung by then. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the room fell quiet, just the quiet beep-beep of equipment signaling that it was over. A nurse slowly pulled the sheet over her face. I remember standing just outside the room, one hand on the doorframe, looking at the machines as they were turned off one by one. No one said anything. It was respectful silence, but not peaceful. It felt incomplete. About 30 minutes later, I was restocking gloves in the supply closet when I heard shouting echo down the corridor. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't the kind of yell you'd hear from someone in pain. No, it was loud and deliberate. Angry. A man's voice, coming from room 9. It was the guy, the one she'd burned. His voice sounded raw, cracked, but he was yelling at someone. "Get her out! Get her out of my room! I told you, get that devil out!" I thought maybe he was hallucinating. People on pain meds do strange things. They mumble. They see people who aren't there. But this wasn't mumbling. This was direct, targeted, furious. Another nurse walked into the room to check on him. A few seconds passed, then she came out looking pale. I asked her if he was okay. "He's wide awake," she said. "He swears she was standing at the end of his bed." That didn't sit right with me. I went to look myself. He was awake, all right, propped slightly up, sweat beading on his forehead, face flushed. He looked directly at me and said, "She was in here, I know it, standing right there near the chair. She was smiling." I glanced at the chair by the window. Nothing, just a folded blanket and an untouched pitcher of water. "I want her gone," he said again, quieter this time. We chalked it up to guilt, maybe even trauma. I'd seen people close to death ramble like that, as if they were speaking to someone from their past. I convinced myself that's all it was. But what I didn't tell anyone, what still keeps me awake sometimes, was what I saw just before I stepped out of his room. The call light at the end of his bed had switched itself on. No one had touched it. Not him, not the nurse, not me. It stayed glowing a soft amber until I pressed it off. He died a few days later. Sepsis, I think. They said his blood pressure never stabilized again after that night. I never wanted to work in a hospital. Not really. But jobs were thin that year, and I'd been laid off from the grocery store just after the holidays. Bills started stacking up faster than I could breathe, and one day I found myself signing a paper to join the dietary staff at a local hospital in Kansas City. I figured I'd just be running trays of bland food up and down elevators. You know, plastic chicken, lukewarm coffee, maybe some half-melted Jell-O cups. I didn't think it'd stick to me, not like that. The kitchen was in the basement, and the walls down there were all stained the same color as dishwater. Dim lights buzzed above metal prep counters and steam carts. Everything smelled like wet salt and onions. I'd load up the trays. Low sodium, diabetic, renal, soft foods, all labeled by room number, and start pushing my cart through the winding service tunnels and elevators that served every floor. I barely saw patients. Usually I'd roll in, place the tray on the side table, mumble something polite, and head out before anyone could strike up conversation. But that day, I still remember the room number, not because of what it was, but because of what it did to me. Room 3. I had just come off the elevator with the dinner cart for the south wing. The hall smelled weird that evening, not like disinfectant or that industrial air freshener they use near the lobby. No, this was something deeper, heavier. It clung to the back of my throat. I could smell it before I reached the room. There were 2 beds in 312, but only one was occupied. I glanced down the hallway, then nudged open the door with my hip, tray in hand. He was already awake, eyes open, watching me. The man, maybe in his 70s, maybe older, was propped up on a stack of pillows, one hand gripping the bed rail. He didn't speak when I came in, just kept watching me, quiet, like he knew something I didn't. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It hit me hard, like rot and rust had soaked into the walls. The kind of smell you instinctively want to back away from. It was stronger here than in the hall. Strong enough that I held my breath and tried not to look directly at his foot, which stuck out from the end of the blanket. But my eyes went there anyway. It didn't look like a foot anymore. His toes were black, some shriveled down to nubs. The skin was broken open around the edges, yellow and raw, with dry flaps that moved slightly when he shifted. The nails, what was left of them, were thick, curled, and dark. Only one foot was exposed. The rest of him was covered tightly under a pale blue blanket, the kind that never seems to hold warmth. I tried to get in and out quick. The tray needed to be placed on the table, which was across from the bed, near the window. That meant squeezing by the foot of his bed. It was a tight fit, and I wasn't really watching where my leg went. I had my focus on balancing the tray and not spilling the cup of lukewarm tea. That's when I felt it. Just a slight brush, my pant leg grazing something soft and strange. I didn't think anything of it at first, just a wrinkle in the blanket, maybe, but the patient let out the smallest gasp, sharp and wet, like he'd swallowed a groan. I turned my head. His eyes were wider now. He looked down at my leg, so did I. There, stuck to my pant leg, was something small, something pinkish gray, with a dark nail at the end. It was his big toenail, and part of the skin beneath it. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. It was just clinging there, like it had decided I'd carry it now. I saw the edge of the nail glistening with something thick and yellow, and for a second I thought I might vomit right there on the tile. We stared at each other. Not a word was spoken. Eventually I managed to set the tray down, my hands trembling slightly, and mumbled the script I always did. "Here's your dinner, sir. Hope everything's all right." Then I backed away. Slow. Respectful. Just like nothing had happened. As soon as I cleared the threshold of his room, I speed-walked to the nurse's station around the corner. My voice cracked when I asked for help, and one of the charge nurses came over to look. She stared for a second, shook her head slowly, and led me into the supply closet. We didn't talk. She grabbed a bottle of industrial-grade disinfectant and soaked the lower half of my pants until it ran cold and burned my skin through the fabric. The smell of it was sharp, chemical, nearly worse than what had happened. I changed scrubs, washed my hands 3 times, tried to forget it. But for the rest of that shift, I kept catching the scent of something rotten clinging to me. Even hours later, when I was sitting in my car in the parking lot with the windows down, I could still smell it on my skin. The thing is, the patient was calm when I left. He didn't yell or cry or seem embarrassed, just kept watching me quiet. Like he knew exactly what he'd given me. Like it wasn't a mistake. I worked a few more shifts that week, but I asked to avoid that wing. Eventually, I heard that the man's condition got worse and his leg was amputated. Someone else took over his meal delivery. I never saw him again. But I never forgot the way the toenail felt, soft and cold, with that twisted bit of flesh still attached. Never forgot the way he looked at me afterward, or the sound of silence in that small room with only one bed filled. And sometimes, when I deliver trays late in the evening and the lights flicker in the hallway, I still catch that smell again. Like something old is watching, waiting. There's something about hospitals at night that doesn't sit right with me. Maybe it's the hum of fluorescent lights echoing down empty corridors, or the way shadows lean long and deep across sterile floors when the halls go quiet. Maybe it's just the silence itself. Silence that makes you notice things you'd normally walk right past during the noise of day. That night had been steady until around 2:40 a.m., when my pager let out a shrill bleep, one of those fast bleeps that means don't finish what you're doing, just move. The call was from the East Wing, room 23, a side room. I was in the middle of double-checking some charting at the desk when it came through. No time to ask what the issue was. I slipped the chart back into the rack and moved down the corridor, walking briskly past a few half-closed doors, some with the faint flicker of televisions inside, others quiet and dark. Room 23 was on the far end, near the fire exit. I remember the door was already slightly open, the fluorescent light inside casting a sliver of yellow across the linoleum. As I stepped in, I paused. The bed was empty. And I don't mean the kind of empty where someone shuffled to the bathroom or needed a nurse's arm. The sheets were untouched, crisp, folded at the corners, no sign of movement. The telemetry monitor was off. The IV pole still stood beside the bed, bag full, line undisturbed. Nothing appeared out of place. It was almost too neat, like the room had been made up for someone who hadn't arrived yet. I stood in the middle of the room for a second, unsure. I thought maybe they'd transferred the patient without logging it. It's happened before, so I turned back toward the door, thinking I'd ask at the nurse's station. But something caught my eye. It was just a flicker at first, a shift in the corner of my vision, near the ceiling. I looked up, and that's when I saw her. There was a face looking down at me. Pale skin, wild eyes, eyes that were wide and unblinking, the kind of stare that doesn't look at you so much as through you. Her hair was plastered to her face, clumps of it dark and stringy with sweat. Her lips were slightly parted, jaw tight like she was either about to speak or had been holding her breath for too long. She was watching me from above, wedged between the metal bars and the stained white tiles of the drop ceiling. Her hands were gripping the beams, elbows bent at impossible angles. I don't even know how she'd gotten up there. I didn't scream. I didn't speak. I just stood there, my eyes locked on hers. Something in me was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My brain was scrambling to explain it. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe it was some illusion from the hallway lights. Maybe it was one of the maintenance guys fixing something. Then she blinked. Not slow, not calm. It was rapid, erratic, like she hadn't done it in minutes, and suddenly remembered how. Her pupils twitched. Her lips moved without sound. I couldn't hear what she was saying, if she was saying anything at all. And then I understood. This was the patient we'd been keeping under close watch. A transfer from the city's psychiatric unit, who had been temporarily held in general while they waited on a bed. She was supposed to be sedated, monitored, but somehow she'd climbed into the ceiling like a rat escaping a trap. I had to get out. I had to tell someone. But the only way back out of that room was underneath her. For a moment I thought about calling out, but I didn't trust what she might do if she saw me reach for my pager. I don't think she even saw me as a person. Her stare didn't flinch, didn't change. I took one step backward, then another. My shoes barely made a sound against the tile. The silence in the room thickened around me like pressure underwater. I moved toward the door slowly, keeping my eyes up. And then her hand moved. It slid across the edge of the metal bar like a spider's leg, her fingers long and thin, nails dirty. Her wrist turned unnaturally, as if bending against the direction it should, and she started muttering, just a soft mumble, over and over. I only caught a few words. "They're poisoning me." My hand reached the doorframe. I slipped out, walked quickly, then broke into a run. Back at the station, a few of the nurses were gathered, flipping through a chart and chatting low. I blurted out what I'd seen without trying to sound like I was making it up. I probably failed at that. But the second I said, "She's in the ceiling," they didn't laugh. They followed me back, 3 of them, along with security. When we opened the door again, the room was quiet and empty. Ceiling tiles displaced, wires hanging. A drip of dust still floating in the air like the last breath of a settling room. No sign of her. They found her 30 minutes later above a different wing, curled up in the ductwork above the pharmacy, muttering about chemicals in the air and invisible people crawling into her ears. Took 3 people to pull her out. She didn't scream, didn't fight. She just stared, right past everyone, right through the walls. After that, they placed her in secure care. But sometimes, even now, when I walk down the quiet end of a night shift and pass by a ceiling panel that's slightly askew, I think of those eyes looking down, watching, waiting, like she never really left. And every now and then, I glance up, just to be sure. I've worked night shifts in the ICU for a while now, and there are certain things I've learned to expect. Alarms, codes, restlessness. But some nights, they just settle under your skin, and no matter how much time passes, they keep scratching at the back of your mind. This happened on a Saturday in early November. The hospital was quieter than usual for a weekend, which is saying something. The fluorescent lights along the corridor outside the unit flickered slightly, humming like a tired old radio. Rain had been falling since late afternoon, tapping against the windows in a soft, steady rhythm. The smell of antiseptic was faintly mixed with the sharp bitterness of burnt coffee from the nurse's station. The shift had just started, and I was assigned to a man in his late 60s who'd come in 2 days earlier after a moderate stroke. He was a difficult case, not just medically. He was restless, confused, and had already taken a few bad tumbles trying to get out of bed. We had his rails up, alarms clipped to his gown, and a camera feed trained on his room. Even with all that, you couldn't blink too long. He'd get tangled in the IVs or try dragging himself toward the door, convinced he was supposed to be somewhere else. Still, his vitals were stable. There was no clinical reason to think he'd deteriorate. The plan was to transfer him to rehab within the week. I just finished repositioning him and checking his blood pressure when the phone rang at the nurse's station. It was nearly 11 p.m. The voice on the other end belonged to the man's son. I didn't know much about him, just that he lived across town and had visited once earlier in the week. But his voice, it shook. Not from tears, not yet. It was more like he was bracing for something. He asked plainly and firmly if he could come see his father. I told him visiting hours were over. He paused and said, "I just need to sit with him. Something doesn't feel right." Now, I've heard family members say things like that before. Usually it's rooted in stress or guilt. But there was something in the way he said it that made me stop and rethink. There was no drama in his tone, no pleading, just certainty. And it was a slow night, so I bent the rules. "All right," I said. "Come in, I'll be here." I went back to the man's room. He was awake, looking out the narrow window, like he could see through the dark. His hands were twitching slightly against the blanket. When I stepped in, he turned toward me with this empty, vacant kind of expression that I'd come to associate with people whose minds are slipping. Still, he was calmer than usual. I did another round of checks. Oxygen levels, heart rate, pupil response, everything was within the range we'd been seeing. I told him his son was on his way. That's when he said it. "Am I bothering anyone?" His voice was soft, not confused, not agitated, just tired. I said no, of course not. It's what we're here for. He gave a little nod, as if that was enough. Then he looked away from me and closed his eyes. Nothing about the moment struck me as significant, until he stopped breathing. There wasn't a sound, no alarm, no sudden drop-off, just a stillness that settled in like dust. I stepped closer. His chest wasn't rising. I checked his pulse. Nothing. Pupils dilated. Skin cooling. I stood there, frozen in that quiet, sterile room, trying to process what had just happened. He was gone. It was less than 2 minutes later that the elevator dinged. I walked out into the hall just in time to see his son step into view, still dripping from the rain. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw me, he didn't even ask. He just stared at my face, then past me toward the open door at the end of the hall. "I knew it," he said. His voice cracked, not from shock, but from something else, like he'd already mourned this moment before it even happened. He walked past me and into the room, gently placing his hand on his father's shoulder like he expected warmth to still be there. Then he started sobbing, loud, sharp, and raw. No one said anything for a long time. There was nothing to say. I'd been doing this for a while, and death was no stranger. But the timing, the way he knew, I couldn't explain it. Later, I replayed the night in my head, over and over. I kept thinking about the man's final words. Am I bothering anyone? The way he said it still echoes in my memory. More like someone preparing to leave than someone seeking comfort. Like he knew his time was nearly up, but didn't want to be a burden. The son stayed with him for nearly an hour, silent for most of it. Before he left, he said something that stuck with me. I just had this feeling when I was lying in bed, like I heard him call my name. Not in a dream. It was louder than that, like he was in the room with me. I wanted to rationalize it, say it was guilt, or stress, or coincidence. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Some things were not meant to explain. Some goodbyes are heard before they're spoken. And some people, they just know when it's time to let go. I worked the evening shift at a small elder care home just outside of Shiloh, North Carolina, a quiet town surrounded by pine woods and long-forgotten back roads. The facility was family-run, had been for decades, and even though it wasn't glamorous, it was clean, peaceful, and most of the residents had either grown up nearby or had no one left to look after them. We became their last family. I started there as a nurse aide, fresh out of school, thinking it would just be a stepping stone until I moved on to hospital work. But I stayed for 6 years, and not because the job was easy. There was something about that place, something I couldn't quite explain. The care home had originally been built in the 1930s as an orphanage. That part wasn't hidden. It was written right into the bricks, carved over the entryway in faded serifed lettering, Sweet Meadow Children's Haven. When the place was bought and converted into a nursing home in the late 70s, they kept the structure mostly the same. Same old narrow hallways, same creaky wood doors, same ivy-strangled courtyard where the kids used to play. But the rooms were repainted and made brighter. Pastel walls, fluorescent lighting, a feeble attempt at comfort. I used to joke that the building itself had a memory. It creaked and sighed differently than any place I'd ever worked in. Even on warm summer days, certain rooms felt cold, not in a temperature sense exactly, but like the space didn't want to be used anymore. The owner, a kind woman with tired eyes who'd inherited the place from her father, admitted to me one night, over lukewarm coffee, that the orphanage had been shut down after an investigation in the 60s. Severe abuse, neglect. Some children had died there. How many? She didn't say. And she said it the way people mention a crack in the ceiling, like it's always been there, and there's no point trying to patch it up. I tried not to dwell on that history. I was there to care for the elderly, not think about ghosts. And besides, I didn't believe in that kind of thing. At least, not at first. The first time I heard about her, I was still new. One of the residents, a retired trucker with early dementia, had been acting confused during dinner rounds. He was laughing softly and talking to someone I couldn't see. I knocked on his door, asked him who he was chatting with. He looked up, grinning like a child caught whispering secrets. "She's shy," he told me. "Little girl came into my room, wouldn't tell me her name, but she said it was cold outside." I gave him a polite smile and said I'd come back in a bit. I told myself it was just the dementia. That's what we're trained to do. Don't argue, redirect, reassure. 3 days later, he died in his sleep. I didn't connect the dots right away. It happens, especially in our line of work. Some folks just slip away. But it was what happened 6 months later that really got under my skin. It was February. The kind of night where the wind scraped at the windows like it was trying to peel the glass from the frames. Only a skeleton crew was on shift. Me, a newer aide, and the night nurse who mostly stayed at the front desk unless called. I was delivering snacks, crackers and ginger ale, mostly. Soft foods for sore mouths, and checking vitals. One of our residents, a quiet man in his 80s, had been declining slowly. Heart failure. He was still lucid though, and polite even when he was tired. I knocked, opened the door, and found him sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, breathing fast, holding the blanket with both hands like he was trying to keep something from dragging it off him. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. He didn't answer. He just stared down at his feet. Then, without looking at me, he whispered, "She's grabbing my legs. I told her to stop. She won't let go." I stepped into the room. The air felt heavy, dense in a way that made my ears ring slightly, like the pressure was wrong. "Who's grabbing you?" I asked. "The girl," he muttered. "She's under the bed." I froze for a moment. Not in fear, but confusion. Then instinct kicked in, and I bent down to look beneath the bed. Nothing, just dust and a dropped sock. I helped him lie back down and sat with him for a bit. He didn't say anything else. His breathing slowed. Eventually, he fell asleep. He died that night. Around 2:30 a.m., the night nurse called it in. "Peaceful," she said. But when I checked the chart, I noticed he had signed out of his meal tray earlier that evening with a shaky note, "Tell her to leave me alone." I started paying attention after that. Quietly, I asked a few coworkers if they'd ever had residents mention a girl. I kept it casual, just curious, not trying to spook anyone. Turns out, I wasn't the only one. "She shows up when it's close," one of the older aides told me, pulling her cardigan tighter. "Sometimes they smile, sometimes they cry. But it's always the same. Right before they go, they see her." Another said she'd heard someone humming in the hallway once, a soft child's voice, when no kids had visited in weeks. "She hums, Ring Around the Rosie," she whispered. "You ever hear a kid hum that slow when no one else is around? It's wrong." The last time I encountered her, I wasn't even on the floor. I was down in the laundry room, loading a cart with linens. That part of the building hadn't changed much since the orphanage days. It was all chipped tile and humming pipes, and this musty, sour smell that never went away, no matter how many air fresheners you plugged in. There's this old hallway that leads from the back stairwell to the boiler room. We don't use it anymore. Lights flicker, ceiling stains. It just doesn't feel right. I was turning the cart around when I heard it. Light footsteps, rapid like someone running barefoot on tile. I paused, thinking maybe one of the aides had come down the back way. Then I saw her. At the end of the hallway, half hidden by the shadows, was the outline of a little girl. She was standing barefoot on the cold tile, wearing what looked like a white nightgown that clung to her like damp fabric. Her hair hung down in front of her face, and even from a distance, I could tell it was matted, almost wet-looking. She tilted her head. I blinked, and she was gone. No sound, no movement, just the distant thrum of the boiler and the smell of bleach. I didn't tell anyone for a while. I wasn't sure what I'd really seen. Maybe I'd been tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But a week later, a resident who'd been declining suddenly whispered to me as I helped her sit up in bed. "She was at the foot of my bed last night, just watching." "Who was?" "The girl," she said. "She had bruises on her neck." That resident died the following evening. You can make of it what you will. Maybe it's just old buildings and failing minds. Maybe death has a way of showing up in forms we recognize, forms that linger, where trauma left a stain. But I know what I saw. I know what I've heard. And I know that when the halls get quiet, when the lights buzz just a little too loud, and a patient starts smiling at the empty corner of the room, it means she's come to visit. And if she visits, they never make it through the week.